Hello and welcome, everyone. It's great to be with you all on what is sure to be a captivating FSMA Friday presentation. My name is Jack Ugatas, and if you don't recognize my voice or my name, that's because I'm filling in for the usual and famous Jim Albright. This month, he's out of town. In a moment, we'll be hearing from a leading global expert on the FDA's intentional adulteration rule and learning about what is changing, how it will be enforced, and how to prepare. But before we begin, there are a lot of newcomers this month. So a little background. FSMA Friday is a monthly series brought to you by Safety Chain and the Atchison Group as a way to provide regular updates, insights, and guidance around changes within the Food Safety Modernization Act. We not only discuss new methodologies and tools to help food and beverage companies meet FSMA requirements, but we give you an opportunity to ask your questions through the lineup of TAG's food safety experts. We have muted all attendee mics, but we will leave some room at the end for Q&A, so please submit your comments and questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll do our best to get through them all. If we do happen to run out of time today and we do not get to your question, don't worry, we'll be sure to follow up with you after the webinar. And of course, this presentation is being recorded, so please keep a lookout for an email with the link in the replay and the slides later today. All right, with that out of the way, I am very excited to have with us one of just 86 people on the planet who is a trained FDA, FSPCA intentional adulteration vulnerability assessment instructor, Mr. Christopher Snaps. As you can see, Christopher has extensive experience in food safety and food microbiology, having worked at the American Proficiency Institute, DIFCO Laboratories, and Domino's Pizza before joining the Atchison Group, where he is now the Director of Food Safety. He's active in many industry groups, such as the International Association for Food Protection, and last year was recognized as a top 10 IAVA lead instructor by the FSPCA based on the number of training participants. Christopher, it really is an honor to have you back on FSMA Friday. Would you like to share any more on your background before we head into some FSMA updates and today's topic?
Thank you, Jack, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. Thanks for introduction. No, that my background's good enough. If people want to find out some more about me, they can go ahead to the TAG website and link on my bio. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, you are in control now, sir.
Thank you. Advance the slide here. There we go. As we always begin with every FSMA Friday, we like to start off with some regulatory updates to let you know what's new in the world. So not a lot this month since last month when Ruth presented. A couple of things. For those of you who are familiar with the hazard analysis, risk-based preventive controls for human food guidance, 2 chapters were released for public comment in September of last year. The comment period for those 2 chapters has been extended. So you now have until May 24th of this year. If you want to submit any comments to the FDA on those rules, you still have time. Coming up on April 24th, there's going to be a free 1-day public meeting on data and technology in the new era of smarter food safety. And this is designed to help the agency improve its understanding of how we can leverage data and technology to exponentially advance food safety and achieve better health outcomes for the food industry. So I welcome everybody to join that if you can. And real quick, the application window for the Voluntary Qualified Importer Program, otherwise known as VQIP, for fiscal year 25, that window is closing May 31st of this year. And that's the latest and greatest for what's been announced by the agency since last FSMA Friday. Today's talk is going to be centering around how the FDA is going to enforce the intentional adulteration rule. Before I talk about that, just a quick background in case some of you are not fully well versed in what the intentional adulteration rule is. I'm sure many of you have heard about it. Intentional adulteration is the deliberate contamination of food with either a biological, chemical, radiological, or physical agent by either an individual or a group of individuals with the intent to cause wide-scale public health harm. This goes beyond individual product tampering. This is different. We're talking about somebody who intentionally wants to harm thousands of people. So we have the Food Defense Rule to help us prevent that from happening. The Food Defense Rule is one of several rules within the framework of FSMA. The final rule is titled Mitigation Strategies to Protect Food Against Intentional Adulteration, 21 CFR Part 121. It requires a covered facility to identify and protect their most vulnerable points against intentional adulteration, most significantly vulnerable. It recognizes that the greatest threat to our food supply is from an inside attacker, somebody who has legitimate access to the production floor. So it could be somebody's already hired to work at your facility. It could be a contractor coming in to do work, say a plumber or painter, electrician. Somebody's coming in to put a new piece of equipment. It could include your pest control offering. Anybody who has legitimate access to the production floor. And it's written in a way to prevent or significantly reduce the likelihood of an inside attacker from committing wide-scale public health harm. And that's the whole purpose of this rule. We want to stop the bad person from trying to contaminate the food who wants to harm a lot of people. A lot of questions we get is, okay, Chris, this rule is out there. Who does this rule apply to? Well, it applies to a lot more than most facilities who have to follow FSMA in the traditional sense, say the preventive controls rule or for human food or animal food. It covers different groups as well. So the first group is the human food facilities, domestic and international, currently regulated by the FDA who follow FSMA. If you're a USDA, FDA dual registered facility, it only covers FDA regulated foods being manufactured at that facility. It also includes acidified foods, bottled water, dietary supplements, infant formula, those who follow juice HACCP, low acid canned foods, seafood HACCP, and a unique one, farms that produce milk. Now, for many of you who are very well versed in FSMA, farms are exempt from FSMA, except farms that produce milk are not exempt from the intentional adulteration rule of FSMA. That's unique to this rule. The first part of any food defense plan that's written is very, very first thing you have to do is what we call a vulnerability assessment. And it's a key component of a written food defense plan. The agency has been very clear. It gives flexibility in how a food facility that's covered can write the vulnerability assessment. Whatever version of vulnerability assessment you use, it must contain or address the following: the public health impact, degree of physical access to what we call an actionable process step, and the ease of introducing a contaminant at the actual process step. And the underlying assumption will be that it is conducted by an inside attacker. Currently, the FDA has 3 scientifically recognized methods to perform a voluntary vulnerability assessment. The first is the most common, the key activity type. And that's basically a simple definition. If the point, step, or process meets the definition of one of 4 cats, it's a cat. And if you identify a step as a cat, it automatically becomes an actionable process step. There are 2 other ways that are a little bit more rigorous. There's the 3-element method and the hybrid method, which combines the cat and the 3-element method. All 3 of these methods are clearly recognized as acceptable and scientifically robust to perform a vulnerability assessment. Now, one thing I want to point out is even this week, one of the facilities I visited, if you rely on, say, a GFSI type recognized food safety audit, say BRC, SQF, FSC 22000, NSF, anyone, if it meets their definition of food defense plan, and or if you're a USDA food facility and you have FDA foods and you're following the USDA food defense plan requirements, you are not following the FSMA-based intentional adulteration rule. It is very specific. And a lot of companies that we visit assume, oh, I have a GFSI type food defense plan. I meet everything under GFSI. I'm okay. You're not okay. You must follow what FSMA requires, first and foremost. So, how has the FDA been enforcing this rule? Well, up until December 23, the agency has been performing what we call quick checks. A quick check is more of an educational inspection of your food defense plan. And it was not being enforced, and there would be no regulatory issues observed that would give you, say, a 483 if you were deficient. It was more of an approach where the agency was educating. They wanted to educate the industry before they regulated. And they've been doing this now for, since the rule's been put out for 5 years. They actually started the quick checks in 2020, and then COVID hit. And so then it got delayed a little bit. And then they started doing the inspections. And in that short time frame, they've done about 1,300 food defense quick checks. When are these done? Well, typically it's at the end of an FDA inspection. Say the FDA came in to do a seafood HACCP inspection, or they came in to do a preventive controls inspection or a GMP inspection. At the very end of that, they spend about 30 to 45 minutes just asking some simple questions. And all you had to say is, yes, I have it, or no, I don't, or it's present, or it's absent. And there was no enforcement. If, for whatever reason, you were deficient in any of the questions they asked, they would give you information on how to fill those gaps. They give you some tools, where to find education, where to find training, and some examples of what was expected. So education was highly, highly stressed. And a common question I get is, Chris, what were some of those quick check questions? And they're pretty generic, they're pretty broad. And these are simple things that they would ask. Do you have a written vulnerability assessment? And if you did, they'd say, what kind did you have? Did you have a CAT assessment, a 3-element assessment, a hybrid? Which one did you use? They would say, have you identified any actionable process steps? And if you have you identified the mitigation strategies to protect those actionable process steps? Then they would ask you some more deeper questions. Do you have any management components in place for those actionable process steps, such as food defense monitoring, food defense verification, and food defense corrective actions? They're very specific. And then would ask a very simple question: has it been signed and dated by a food defense qualified individual? These were just general questions. They were collecting data to see how the food industry has been implementing this rule. What did they find out? Roughly 200 facilities that they asked the quick checks found out, oh my goodness, they're not covered by the rule because they were considered what we call a very small business based on monetary dollars. And that was food produced and food held at your facility over a 3-year average. And that was $10 million when the rule came out. When you adjust that for inflation today, that's roughly about $11.2 million. So if you were below that level, you didn't have to abide by this rule. What about those that did, of the 1,100 other facilities? Well, a little surprise. They found out that about 70% are using the key activity type vulnerability assessment approach. The agency said, that's a little bit higher than we expected, but completely acceptable. It's a valid way to do a vulnerability assessment. They said, that's okay. They do expect, however, that number is going to go down. And the reason why is when it's time to review your food defense plan, which is typically done at a minimum of once every 3 years, they'll probably choose the 3-element or hybrid method because those two methods typically will reduce the number of actionable process steps you have. And of course, the less APSs you have, less management components you need, and the easier it is to implement your food defense plan. Now, what's new? Well, starting this fall, roughly in September of this year, the agency has announced they're going to begin comprehensive enforcement of this intentional adulteration rule. This comprehensive approach will be a detailed review of the written food defense plan and it's implemented. They're going to look at a few things. They're going to look at the adequacy of your plan and the appropriateness of your identification of an actual process step. A lot of that's going to be looking at your written rationale. So the food defense rule is very clear. If you determine a point step or process is an actual process step, you have to tell us why it is or why it is not. You just can't say, yes, it is. No, it's not. Why? What is your rationale? They're going to look at that. That's the first half. The second half is they're going to go on the floor and see if you're implementing everything that you have written down. So ask yourself, are the food defense mitigation strategies working? Do you have records of trained workers and supervisors at each APS and of those who write the different portions of the food defense plan? Do you have records that show food defense monitoring and food defense verification and or food defense corrective actions if needed? They're going to be looking for that. Now, who's going to be doing these inspections? Well, the agency is going to be having consumer safety officers do the inspection. Initially, they have created what we call a food defense inspection team, and that's their logo at the bottom of the screen, the existing logo. That may change, I don't know. And it currently consists of 1 supervisor and 5 highly trained CSOs. The CSOs will have vast experience in food manufacturing platforms, many, many different types of platforms. They'll also have experience in preventive control and or food safety enforcement experience, as well as in-depth food defense training. These are going to be some very highly trained and experienced individuals. To a lot of people's surprise, when the CSO arrives at your facility, guess what? You're going to get 2 482s. For those of you who don't know what a 482 is, it's a letter that the agency says, we are here to inspect your facility for X. In this instance, you'll be issued a 482 for food safety inspection, as well as a food defense inspection. How are they going to do that? Well, they have a choice. It's up to the CSO. But for example, they could issue a 482 for food safety, perform a food safety investigation, such as a check for a seafood HACCP. They might check you for a preventive control plan, go through all that inspection, walk the floor for food safety issues, and then they'll close it out. Then they're going to give you a second 482 for food defense. They'll open that investigation, walk the floor, look at your paperwork, and then they will close that out. A single CSO will perform both inspections. Now, for many of you who've had an FDA inspection, typically it's more than 1 officer comes on site. For this, it's going to be a single CSO, and they're going to do both inspections. And the idea is typically to have it done in roughly 1 day. So it'll be a long day. The reason for for 242s is that food safety issues may be discovered while the CSO is on the floor, and it could be discovered while they're doing the food defense inspection. Many existing food safety and facility practices can have a dual food defense function as well as food safety function. Additionally, the agency envisions that this could decrease the food inspection burden on the facility as well as the agency. So, for example, instead of having 2 inspections done on 2 different dates or multiple dates by 2 different sets of people by the FDA, they're going to do both at the same time by 1 person. And this will also reduce the amount of burden on the agency, so they don't have to go there twice. The CSOs are going to be trained on a uniformed determination of adequacy at your facility for consistency. So no matter which of the 5 CSOs come to your facility, they're going to assess you identically for food defense. So it's meant to be a very uniform, consistent inspection. The CSO will try to resolve issues with your facility in addressing any deficiencies while they're discovered on site. To help them, CFSAN is going to have food defense SMEs available for real-time consultation and technical support. They'll actually call the food defense SME while they're with you on the floor to discuss anything that may or may not be an issue to see if they can resolve it. Now, while they're on the floor, they have emphasized that they will do everything they can not to take any photography. If there's a discussion while the CSO is on the floor and they see a potential actionable process step or mitigation issue, and it can't be resolved between the CSO and the facility, and it might be something very unique, the CFSAN Food Defense SME will be contacted first through a telephone call, see if they can resolve it, and if necessary, they'll do a screen share of, say, that particular APS or potential APS, and they'll discuss it. And that's only going to happen very rarely. In addition, the agency is going to do everything it can not to collect any food defense facility documentation. Why is that? Well, these point steps or procedures that are considered an actual process step are your significant vulnerabilities. They don't ever want to release that to the public or to share it with anybody. They don't need to know what your vulnerabilities are. And the agency understands the sensitivity of that. If, for whatever reason, they do have to collect anything, right now, the food defense inspection team is developing specific SOPs as how they're going to collect any food defense documentation, only if necessary. And then they're going to develop a restricted access protocol for those documents on a need-to-know basis only. So they're really going out of their way to make this very simple for the facility and in a way where any potential sensitive information is not released. So they're going out of their way to talk about it. And hopefully, if you have an issue on the floor, they can resolve it with you. So that's their intent, to help resolve any issues. So, CSOs on the floor, can you get a 483A now? For those of you who don't know what a 483A is, that's an official letter that the FDA gives you when they see any observations that are deficient of the rule, and you have typically 15 business days to reply as how you're going to either have it addressed or a plan to address it in the future. If you refuse entry to a CSO, it's going to constitute an official refusal. Typically, most companies do not want to go down that path. A 483 could be issued for both food safety and or food defense. So for example, facility can get a 483 for food safety, only if warranted, and they can get a separate 483A for food defense if it's warranted. Unlike prior 483s where everything is written down and it's open to the public to see if they were to FOIA it, the 483 for food defense is going to be different. since we're dealing with very sensitive information, it's only going to say one thing. The facility is not following CFR Part 121.126. That's all it's going to say. There will be a separate appendix that will not be made public, and it will be sent directly to the facility only. The appendix will list very specific points that could not be resolved while the CSO is there on the floor. That will not be public. The only public thing it'll say is you're not following 121.126. Now, if for some reason you get a 483 for food defense and you improperly respond or you ignore it, it could be cause for a food defense warning letter. The warning letter is going to be done in the same way. It'll be public information that says you're not following 121.126, and there'll be a private appendix listing the observations that the facility has failed to address properly and timely. Now, you're probably saying to yourself, I have only 5 CSOs. They're going to look at all the food facilities in the US and in the world. Well, they have decided that they're going to conduct just a limited number of prioritized facility inspections first. And they're going to focus their resources on where they believe intentional adulteration concern is highest. How are they going to do that? How are they going to say who's got priority? Currently, they're working on what they call a matrix. Approximately 43 different elements have been inputted into this matrix. Now, these elements that consist the matrix are not going to be issued to the public. However, the agency has given an example. One potential matrix element that they talked about could be if a facility has a documented past history of having an inadequate food safety plan. And typically, it's expected that same facility would usually not have an adequate food defense plan. And that would be cause for an inspection. So, if you have an inadequate food safety plan that the agency has already documented at your facility, then, you may or may not be rising towards the top of being one of those prioritized facilities that's going to get an inspection. Now, a couple of things as we finish up this webinar before we take any questions is this is brand new regulatory territory for the agency. The agency has been very well versed in food safety for decades. Food defense is different. So they want to make sure as they're going out into the food world that they're very consistent. And there's going to be a consistent food defense evaluation by the CSO. Therefore, as we speak, they're undergoing very rigorous training to make sure that no matter which of the CSOs go out there, every assessment will be done appropriately and accordingly and with very, very good rigor. Another thing to remember, this is domestic and international. So if there's an international facility that exports food to the United States, it too has the right to be inspected. The food defense inspection team will increase the number of CSOs over time. Right now, they're thinking roughly about 15. And as I said, currently there's only 5. All those 5 currently have been hired within existing FDA staff. The long-term goal is to have all facilities on a 3-year cycle of inspections. Just like food safety is supposed to be on a 3-year cycle inspections, their long-term goal is to have facilities inspected for intentional adulteration once every 3 years. CIFSA and Food Defense SMEs are working with the National Conference on Interstate Milk Shipment, the NCIMS, on a specific SOP on how to inspect farms produce milk. So that's a unique characteristic where it's the only part of farms they have to follow this part of the IA rule. Food defense qualified individual training is key for each segment of the intentional adulteration rule. For those of you who are not well versed in this rule is different say is different than preventive controls training. It has various segments, and each segment has its own set of training. And for those facilities that have an actual process step, specific training is required for the worker who works at the APS as well as their immediate supervisor. They have to have some other additional training. Sometime in the spring, and we don't know when yet, it hasn't been announced, the agency is going to give us an update on where they are on these SOPs, any other information that you can give us about how they're going to enforce this rule. All the information that I gave you today is based on 2 prior webinars that the FDA has put on. And so this is kind of a condensation of those 2 webinars. And that's about it. I'm open for any questions.
Thank you, Christopher. Thank you for boiling down this rule for everyone and really setting expectations on what facilities can expect. You kind of answered one of the most common questions, which was, how do you have this info? Is there going to be a more formalized plan for the FDA to share this info? It sounds like that might be that final update kind of going towards the end of the summer.
We'll see. They haven't announced when the next webinar will be. At the end of the second one, they just said sometime this spring. So very, very open and generic.
Got it. Well, a lot of these plans, they require training and involvement from many roles in the facility. What have you seen work in the field when helping food facilities with their food defense plans and training?
First of all, is understanding that, number one, they have to follow the rule. The next thing is actually taking the training. There's many ways where you can be trained. There's actually free training for several of the components of the food defense rule on the FSPCA website. You could take that training with or without a certificate, with or without a fee. There's only one portion of that training where you have to have a lead instructor, and that's the intentional adulteration's 3-element portion, and that's only done through, as I said, specified training by lead instructor. Other things that can be done is, use your existing food safety plans and your food facility protocols to assist you, to help you implement food defense type of mitigation strategies and food defense protocols. The agency says, why recreate the wheel? If you have some components from your food safety plan, go ahead and use them for a food defense plan if it meets the food defense requirements. So that's another thing we like to tell people, don't recreate the wheel if you don't have to.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions actually about the specifics of creating a plan, and specifically someone is asking what is CAT? What are those key activity types? Maybe you can explain just those 4 main types.
Right. So there are 4 main activities that the agency has boiled down through long time vulnerability assessments over many, many different types of commodities of food. And that deals with bulk liquid receiving and transport, secondary ingredient handling, a couple other various things, and they're very specific on what those 4 are. If you're not familiar with the key activity types, there is actually there's free training on the FSPCA website that takes you through that. It's short, it's about an hour long. And those are the points, steps, or procedures that the agency has done a lot of homework for you. They said if it meets the definition of one of these 4 key activity types, it's an actual process step. And, the agency has seen that roughly 70% of the food industry has just been following the CAT type of vulnerability assessment, which is completely acceptable. It doesn't require as much training. It's easy to apply. It does require additional training, such as, what is your mitigation going to be if you identify a key activity type that becomes an actual process step. So there's lots of information out there. More than happy to discuss that further with anybody if they want to.
Yeah, you mentioned about 70% of facilities who went through those initial quick checks used the the cat vulnerability assessment, which the FDA expects to go down. Is that still a good, sounds like it still is a good place to start for most facilities. It's not necessarily missing elements important to a more robust food defense plan.
Correct. Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Yep. A lot of facilities are doing that. A lot of facilities, they meet the monetary definition of being a covered facility, but they don't have a lot of personnel, they don't have a lot of free time. So it's in order to meet the requirements of the role, they'll use the CAT method. And it doesn't take long to do a CAT assessment of your facility. You start with your existing food safety plan and your existing flow charts and the existing description of each step of that flow chart. And if the description in that step meets one of the 4 CATs, then it becomes an actual process step. And then you implement your mitigation strategies and write your food defense plan.
And if you say you perform a vulnerability assessment on each food process point, step, procedure, and no APS has been identified, is that all right? Can you move on? Should that be documented?
That's a great question. And I've actually worked with a couple of facilities where that has happened. So as I said earlier, you must do the vulnerability assessment first. And if for any reason you have identified no APSs, for each step that you assessed, you have to say why it is not an APS. And let's say you have 35 steps, and all 35 steps, you say it does not meet the definition of any of the key activity types. Then you just have to write a little summary. Say, our facility does not have any key activity types. Therefore, we do not need a written food defense plan. Our vulnerability assessment has shown there's no key activity types. There's no actual process steps. Sign it and date it, and you're good for another 3 years, unless there's been a change, of course, to your facility or your process.
Understood. Now, there are a lot of folks asking if those initial 2 webinars are available online. I take it they are. Do you have somewhere that people can look to find those webinar recordings?
There's one on YouTube, and one was only limited to lead instructors for the vulnerability assessment through the FSPCA.
Okay. Yeah, and as a reminder to folks, TAG is available to answer questions specific to your facility. So please do reach out to them if you have specific questions. Continuing along with some questions rolling in, can the Food Defense Plan Builder on the FDA's website be an appropriate written food defense plan?
Oh, excellent question. So, yes, you can use the Food Defense Plan Builder version 2.0. It is completely aligned with the rule. It's a little clunky. I've used it, helped companies use it. If you used way back when they had version 1.0, unfortunately, it is not aligned with the rule. So you have to use version 2.0. One caveat to that, you still need to take the training that's required to use the Food Defense Plan Builder. I worked with a company once where they took no training and they just randomly picked numbers and definitions, and they thought they were completely covered, and it was a disaster. It was a mess. So you can use version 2.0, but please take the right training before you start filling out all that paperwork. But it does align with the rule 100%.
Okay, that's good to know. There are some questions around, folks who have experience and certificates from food fraud vulnerability assessments. Is that the same as a food defense vulnerability assessment? Is there any overlap?
It is not the same. So the food defense intentional adulteration rule vulnerability assessment is very specific to the facility. Food fraud is a completely different type of assessment. And typically, most food fraud does not involve food safety. The agency is very well stresses that they are more concerned about food safety than food quality or food fraud. So they are not the same.
Got it. All right. Now, you mentioned this rule covers foreign and domestic. There are questions pertaining to that. Can you explain how maybe someone with a history of an inadequate food safety plan can prioritize a facility that's maybe international?
Sure. So typically for domestic inspection, it's going to be a single CSO. For an international facility, the Food Defense Inspection Team is going to work with the agency that wants to assign what they call a cadre. Typically, a few team members will do foreign inspections. And they'll ask that cadre based on our list, who are you visiting? And they'll look at this quote unquote matrix of prioritized sites and see if any of those facilities rise to the top. If so, to join that cadre for that international. If the international facility is known to have food safety issues, or they have an inadequate food safety plan, maybe they were the cause for a recall, they're going to rise to the top, the cream of the top, so to speak, and they'll be more likely to have a food defense inspection by a CSO. So that's a little different nuance with the international inspections.
Understood. Now, does folks are asking about that food defense qualified individual. Do you have to have an FDQI at each facility, including all dairy farms?
So the dairy farm inspection protocol, as I said, still being hashed out with an SOP. So I can't talk specifically on how that is going to be inspected and what's going to be required. So that has not been released. I'm hoping that kind of information is released on the spring update. For the other facilities, do you need a food defense qualified individual? The answer is yes. Do you have to have FSPCA, Food Safety Crime Control Alliance training to be a food defense qualified individual? Technically, no. As long as you can prove either through experience, education, other training that you are qualified to be FDQI and it's documented, then you could be FDQI that way. Typically, we always suggest that you take the training by the FSPCA or somebody who can deliver that training, just so you're well versed in what we call the alphabet soup of the FDA. You know what kind of terminology they expect you to know and how things are applied. So there's two ways to be FDQI, either, as I said, through FSPCA training or through on-site experience, education, and other means, as long as it's documented. One thing I want to stress, each part of the intentional adulteration rule has different segments that have different types of training. One person could take all the segments of training, or you can have different people take different trainings on different segments. So for example, you could have one person take the key activity type training. You could have another person take the mitigation strategies training. You could have another person who takes the management component training. And then you could have another person who takes training on how to write it all together into a single food defense plan. So you could share responsibilities of writing the food defense plan, or you can have a single person take all of them. Typically what we see at TAG is people usually take all the different segments, so they're well versed on how all the different segments interact with each other to write a very robust food defense plan.
Yeah, that sounds like a smart way to approach it. How often would one need to do that, or should one do an FDQA retraining?
So food defense qualified individual is a one and done. So you only have to take it once. Never hurts to take retraining, especially if you don't apply it often, or you learned it once and a few years go by and somebody says, well, we want you to write our plan, and you might have forgotten a lot of things. It doesn't hurt to take a refresher. But technically, you only need to go through the training once.
There you go. Sounds good. And if someone is regulated by the, the USDA alone, does this IA rule still apply to them?
No. So USDA foods are exempt. Animal food is exempt. For the most part, the alcohol industry is exempt. There are some exemptions to that, though. So those are typically the buckets that are exempt.
Got it. And we're running out of time, but I'll ask just a couple more questions. When does an APS maybe no longer be considered an APS because there are, robust mitigation steps in place? Or will the APS always be considered an APS no matter the mitigation?
So determine an APS is you can do it in a couple different ways. If you use the CAT method, and if it still meets the definition of a CAT, then it'll always be an APS. Another way is if you were to apply the 3-element or a hybrid method, things change when you go to reevaluate and the score and the justification for the APS can change. There can be a time where an APS can be reduced to not being an APS. But there's lots of variables in that, and that would be very, very site specific and APS specific. One other thing I want to mention is the food defense plan is specific to the site, to the facility, just like a food safety plan. So you can't have a corporate food defense plan that covers all your plants. You can have a corporate policy, but the actual written food defense plan is site specific.
That is I think a very good distinction to end on. Yeah, you could have a corporate-wide maybe SOP, but site-specific. Make sure that everyone is going back to their facility, even if maybe your facility is a couple blocks away from the next one.
Correct. Absolutely.
All right. Well, we're just at about time, but I know that there are still some more specific questions that are left unanswered. We can send them along to the TAG team. As a reminder, this is a recorded webinar. We'll send out the recording link and also those training links we talked about later this afternoon. Once everyone here has digested this information with your team, Christopher and the Action Group experts, as I said, are happy to answer the IA or food safety related questions specific to your facility. I'll pop their email up. You can see up on this slide right here, or visit the atchinsongroup.com. Safetychain.com also has a bunch of available resources in partnership with TAG, including past FSMA Friday recordings. And this webinar series occurs every month, so stay tuned for the next topic. Christopher, thank you again for your time and fitting us in with your busy traveling schedule. I know everyone watching greatly appreciates it, and we really do hope to have you back soon.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you everybody for joining today. Enjoy your weekend.
Yeah, all right. Enjoy your weekend, everyone. Take care and hopefully see you next month. Bye-bye.